Opening statement by Bill Blair, former police officer, now Minister of Emergency Preparedness, gives his observation on the illegal blockades, protests, occupation. Also states in his opening statement why the Ottawa police couldn't clear out Capitol Hill. Here's the clip.
Thank you very much, Senator. And first of all, let me begin by expressing my very sincere thanks to this committee for their invitation and the opportunity to speak before you today. Madam Chair, the Emergencies Act invocation on February 14th was the first use of this statute since it was created in law in 1988. The decision to invoke the Emergencies Act was a significant decision for any government to make, and as such, it deserves close examination and scrutiny, and I am grateful for the hard work of this committee to perform that important role on behalf of all Canadians. Madam Chair, responsibility for maintaining public order in Canada, enforcing our existing municipal bylaws, provincial statutes, and the criminal code is the responsibility of the police of jurisdiction. They also have the important responsibility of upholding the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to facilitate lawful, peaceful protest. And in Ontario, these authorities and that responsibility is well defined within the Ontario Police Services Act. And for the use of this committee, and I know, Madam Chair, that this is something you're very familiar with, but I've brought in both official languages a copy of the Ontario Police Services Act, which I hope will be helpful to this committee. Madam Speaker, as the events of the convoy and the protests unfolded, initially with rolling convoys across Canada, then the establishment of an encampment of protesters in the city of Ottawa, the fortification of that encampment with heavy trucks and trailers, and then what we witnessed was targeted blockades, which effectively blocked vital trade corridors and cut off the movement of goods and essential services to our manufacturing sector and the movement of essential goods and services throughout the country. Those blockades and the impact of those border blockades in particular was particularly impactful, and I know previous witnesses have articulated for this committee what some of those impacts are. I have also received correspondence from my ministerial colleagues in Alberta, from the Premier in Manitoba, and from others across the country articulating some of the huge challenges that those blockades represented and the threat to the economic security of those provincial jurisdictions, municipalities across the country. And we've also heard extensive reports from the private sector and manufacturing about the enormous impact those blockades were having. Throughout the course of this event, we observed in many jurisdictions, including right here in Ottawa, that law enforcement was unable to resolve the serious and harmful behaviors that were taking place in a timely and effective way. And for example, the police were unable to remove the heavy trucks that were blocking many of the streets in Ottawa and on municipal and provincial roadways in Ottawa, Windsor, Emerson, Manitoba, Coutts, Alberta, and on the Pacific Highway in British Columbia. In order to determine why the police were having this difficulty, I had conversations and consulted directly with the police leadership and the mayor here in Ottawa, for example. I asked the chief of police in Ottawa if he could advise me why they were unable to tag and tow the vehicles. In my experience, as I spent many years in policing, the tagging and towing of those vehicles seemed like a logical step. But the chief advised me, and I accepted his explanation, that he did not believe that could be done without provoking violence, or it could not be done safely by his bylaw enforcement officers. I then spoke to him about towing the vehicles off the street, and he advised me that notwithstanding that they had a number of service contracts with towing companies in the Ottawa and the National Capital Region, that none of those towing companies were willing to come and remove those vehicles, because in the Chief Slowly's advice was that they were concerned for their safety or for their ongoing business relationship with the trucking industry. But in any event, they would not respond. I had heard similar information, by the way, in my conversations with Minister McIver in Alberta, who identified that they were unable to secure tow trucks to remove the vehicles from the Coutts Highway. And he asked, and we examined whether it was possible, whether or not there was any other towing vehicles that were available to the Canadian government. We examined what was available to the Canadian Armed Forces, for example, and were advised that they did not have appropriate vehicles for that purpose and that they were unable to assist. But that problem persisted. I also had conversations with the Commissioner of the RCMP as to the challenges the RCMP were facing in the removal of those blockades in the highway in Coutts. And I asked why the Alberta Highway Traffic Act wasn't being utilized to direct traffic off those roadways or to remove the vehicles that were blockading. I was advised by the Commissioner that they had information and they were conducting an investigation about the presence of firearms at that particular blockade. And she was quite understandably very concerned about the safety of her officers in engaging in that activity. But ultimately, I was advised that until they were able to subsequently, through investigation, make arrests and seizure of those weapons, that those circumstances did not allow them to use their authorities as existed under municipal, provincial, and federal statutes. And as a consequence, those blockades persisted for a considerable period of time, over 2 weeks in Alberta, over 7 days in Windsor. And throughout those occupations, we were also advised that there was a strong likelihood of further blockades at points of entry like the Blue Water Bridge in Sarnia, the Pacific Highway in Surrey, the Peace Bridge in Fort Erie, that there was strong information being received from our officials advising of the intent of these blockades to return to places that they had previously blocked or to go to new points of entry because it had been a very effective tactic.
And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut you off there so we can get to